QSO Today, episode 216, Poularas VK2GRP. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. Before we get started, I want to thank all of you who send me feedback and emails, sponsor transcripts, and have been steady supporters of the QSO Today podcast over the years. I really appreciate all of it. I did receive an important message because I've been mentioning the A-word name of the Amazon Echo in the recent podcast, and therefore I've been setting them off. Beginning in this episode, I will not say the female equivalent of the name Alex. My apologies. My QSO today is with Poularas VK2GRP, who even with his busy schedule and a vast array of hobbies besides amateur radio, has a time to restore vintage tube radios from the screws up. In this episode, Ray will tell us how he remanufactures replacement parts on military radios more than 80 years old to make them look new as if they just came out of the factory. Ray documents many of his restoration projects on his Tube Radio Australia website with the link available in this week's show notes pages. If you have an interest in vintage military radio restoration and the time management secrets to getting it all done, stay tuned for this QSO today. VK2GRP, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ray?
Hey, Eric 1UG, this is VK2GRP. How are you doing?
Great, Ray. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. First of all, before we start, can you tell us where you're located right now? What's the QTH?
My QTH is Sydney, Australia, and the town is Greystanes.
Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
So my journey with radio really started when I was about 5 years of age, and my father had bought me a little ladybird book which showed how to make a crystal radio from general household items that you had lying around, very similar to the early foxhole radios. And that really was the beginning of my interest in electronics per se, and started me on a trajectory which took me to doing some electronics engineering in later life, and basically playing with electronics as a hobby all through my early childhood and teenage years, at which point I started to play with shortwave radio and then eventually ham radio. So look, that's how I got started, and probably the wheels really fell off a little later on in my career when I started to get interested in military radio, and I did a bit of work for the military in my early days, fresh out of university, working on interesting projects.
When did you get your first license, and what was your first call sign?
So my first call sign was an F call sign, so it was FGRP, and that would have been when I was about 19, so it was fairly early in the piece. And it was really so I could, in those days, play with CB radio more than anything, because in those days you needed to have a license to have a CB radio as well as an amateur radio license to have amateur radio in Australia. And so that was when I really started with my journey in the ham radio direction.
Now, you say that electronics was always part of your growing up, your childhood. That was certainly then the way that you chose the education and career that you pursued. How did you pursue your education and career?
I was very lucky early in the piece. When I had finished high school, although I'd been an electronics enthusiast, I didn't have any formal training. And I had applied for some roles, and I was lucky enough to obtain a traineeship with an organisation that was developing microcomputers and building and developing those from scratch in Australia.
What kind of computers are those?
They were S100 microcomputers.
Okay, yes, I remember.
Yeah, and there were two companies that I worked for very early in the piece. One was called IMS, Industrial Microsystems, and the other one was called AED, Acoustic Electronic Design. And both of those organisations were at the forefront of S100 technology at that point in time. And around about the same time, I was also training in university and started to do my electronics engineering certificate. And I was approached by a government organisation as part of their, we won't call it a traineeship program, but as part of their recruitment program to come and join them part-time and work on electronics designs, for which they would assist in paying for my formal education at university. And obviously I jumped at that opportunity.
And how long were you involved with this organization after your studies?
So all up about 7 years in total. And at that point in time, I basically decided that I was going to specialise in information technology and not so much go down the path of doing electronics design research in the military foray. So I specialised into information technology, and that's pretty much where my career moved to over the next 30 years.
Now, it's my understanding that you're still involved in information technology. What are you doing now professionally?
So professionally, I'm the manager for enterprise architecture for an organisation looking after their application architecture strategic programs. So I have had significant involvement with a lot of financial institutions in the banking and finance sector, and now I'm working in the utility sector.
I see a mention on LinkedIn that you're working with Sydney Water.
That's correct. Yes, I am.
We forget that all of these water companies are using cutting-edge technology just to manage their resources.
And it is interesting because, yes, with the advent of IoT, it really brings together a whole heap of disciplines which are very near and dear to my heart. So radio telemetry, low cost, small footprint, low current usage computing, and sensors. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we do which tie together some of my key interests, including my key interest in radio.
So does the Sydney Water Company use any IoT devices like Raspberry Pis or Arduinos for any management and control, at least maybe on the experimental level?
Look, Sydney Water are experimenting with a lot of interesting different platforms, and some of those technologies are platforms that we've experimented with. But when it comes to productionising those platforms, it's a different story. And obviously, with IoT being at the forefront of where it is at the moment, it's going to be some time before we have production-grade ready devices that we can deploy throughout the environment. When
did amateur radio really start to take hold for you and kind of move into the area where you are now?
So probably around my mid-20s, I took up a keen interest in amateur radio. And it wasn't until a little later on that I sort of diversified into some of the stuff that I play with now. But in the 80s, you had to be very lucky to have a nice amateur radio. And I remember Dick Smith Electronics used to have a wonderful range of shiny new Yaesu sets that I used to go and drool over regularly. But in those days, I could ill afford those. So there was a lot of home brewing that went on. There was a lot of resurrecting of very early pieces of technology, mostly valve-based, to get on the air and basically talk to people and experiment with different types of antennas and see how far you could actually make contacts with a limited budget and a limited capability from a technology perspective.
So what was your first rig then? Was it a Yaesu from Dick Smith?
No, my first rig was actually a home brew rig, and it was partially made out of an AWA commercial set that they had, which was used for ship-to-shore communications and modified to be on the amateur frequencies. It was all of a glorious 12 watts, and it basically was AM and CW. I didn't have any sideband capability in those days. And basically it taught me a lot about the analog radio components and how you could modify a very early, very primitive AM transceiver. And that was my very first rig. And then a little bit later on, I managed to get my hands on a second-hand Yaesu FT101. I believe it was an early one. It might have been an E. And that was my mainstay rig for probably a good 10 or 11 years. And I still have that rig today, actually.
And do you still enjoy operating it?
I do. I enjoy operating that rig very much. I've since got I've got some earlier rigs, which I've acquired sort of later on my journey, which are all Hallicrafters rigs, and they have independent transmitters and receivers, so you have to net them. And I actually really use that station as my main station most of the time because I just enjoy using it. I enjoy, netting the two together, and I enjoy the quality of the audio that comes out of the rigs.
Do you have any problems with people telling you you're drifting when you're operating?
The interesting thing is that the Hallicrafters setup that I have, the VFO tubes are actually on all the time, so the radio is pretty much, from the perspective of how much drift it has, not too bad, and I usually run them for about 15 or 20 minutes before I get on the air just to make sure that everything is up to temperature. The only thing that you find is sometimes they might say that you might be a few kcs off on the transmit frequency, but that's because you're manually netting things together, and I have a monitor scope and a frequency, digital frequency meter there, and I sort of track exactly where I am. So everything that I have there in that Hallicrafter station has analog readouts, so you need to have a few mod cons to make sure you need to be where you are.
What's your favorite operating mode?
Look, I think sideband. I did a lot of CW early in the piece. My CW is not fantastic, and there are guys out there that are far better than I am. But look, I really enjoyed working the sideband on 20 metres, and I've made contacts all over the world with literally 80 watts barefoot, running my vintage Hallicrafter station into a multi-band vertical antenna. So nothing flash. I had space limitations in the place I was at, and I couldn't put up a nice directional Yagi, so I had to make do with what I had and make that as efficient as possible. And that's pretty much my favourite operating mode at the moment. I do get on FSK every now and then, but I have some difficulties with the current conditions making the haul across to the US to the boys on 80 metres.
Well, I discovered you quite by accident when I went looking for military surplus tube radios for a picture to use on an earlier episode of QSO Today. Your site, tuberadio.com, is absolutely amazing, and I encourage the listeners to visit it. I'll put the link in the show notes page. How did you get started in the restoration of old rigs?
Pretty much from necessity. As I said in the early days, I didn't have a lot of money to spend on radios, so being handy and being able to take old radios or old radio components and turn them into something useful was a key skill that you needed to develop. And some of the other hobbies that I used to work on that taught me skills that I could leverage for my radio hobby came in handy. Mechanical skills, engineering skills. I used to do a lot of vehicle restoration work on old vehicles, and those core skills to repair metalwork and rebuild chassis and do all the mechanical aspects became very, very handy. It wasn't until probably the early 90s that I seriously started to think about collecting and restoring some of the military radio gear that I've done over the last 20-odd years. And a colleague of mine, Ray Robinson, who shares the website with me, by the way, who I met through the university, I hold solely responsible for taking me down the military radio path. And it's been a lot of fun. Look, we've restored and rebuilt a number of very nice historical items. And there's another colleague of ours that we share information and equipment with, who runs the Kurrajong Radio Museum up at Kurrajong Heights there in New South Wales. So it's handy to have all of these resources to run ideas past and then get information from, so that you can actually rebuild and restore this equipment.
How do you choose a restoration project? What are the factors?
Look, generally, what normally happens is that we would be having a conversation with our radio group, and we would decide that for the next Wyong field day that we wanted to have a theme. Every year we attend the Wyong field day, and we have a display table there, and we like to show off some of the restorations that we've done through that year. And we'll also generally run a series of nets through the day using the equipment that we've restored. So on a couple of occasions, we decided that we were going to restore some World War II aircraft equipment and use that on the day. And I basically decided that it would be really nice to try and replicate all of the radio equipment that was used in the B-24 and have the command sets and the ART-13 and any other equipment, the direction finding gear. So they have all of that equipment up and running so that people could see what was used in that aircraft at that particular time, and they could touch and feel it and use it, and we could run a couple of nets on amateur radio frequencies through the day for people that brought in, portable radios on those frequencies.
What was the name of the organization that you belong to?
So the field day is the Wyong Amateur Radio Field Day.
Can you spell that?
And that's run by WYONG, Wyong. And it's run by the Central Coast Amateur Radio Club. And Wyong is basically a suburb up on the Central Coast of New South Wales.
After the last field day, the group gets together, you decide what the theme is going to be, and you decide what kind of radios you're going to bring. Well, how do you find those radios? I mean, I look at your pages, and you've got amazing stuff, and that stuff is 70 years old at this point?
Yeah. Look, there are lots of different resources for finding that sort of equipment. It's a combination of sometimes surfing eBay and looking for particular pieces of gear that you're after, talking to our various contacts all over the globe who are either dealing with estates or they've come across equipment that they don't know what to do with and they're not really interested in playing with. And generally we'll either swap something with those individuals, even museums that are looking for a particular piece of gear and have gear that they want to swap. So there are a number of different resources. There are field days, the usual places that you would find them. There's organisations that run auctions like the Historical Radio Society, and also the WIA run a Trash and Treasure every 2 months. And you basically turn up and sometimes opportunities avail themselves and you procure the bits of equipment via those methods. So it's been like 20 years of collecting plus looking at different auction sites and different estate sales, and basically just going and cherry picking the items that you think that maybe one day you would want to restore or play with. Most of them are historical. I've got a lot of equipment from the Second World War period, and that's the sort of gear that I basically like to restore and get into operational standard so that we can play with that and basically run some field days and let people see what that equipment operated like.
Now, how deep do you go? Do you strip those radios right down to the screws and actually completely rebuild it? And if you rebuild it, are you building it with plastic-coated wire, or do you try to find the same vintage wire that you... is it important for it to be inside as vintage as possible?
So, look, generally the rule of thumb is I'll do a safety assessment and have a look at the equipment. In some cases, surprisingly, the equipment is in reasonably good shape, especially if it's got antifungal coatings on the inside. I did a restoration of the SCR 522, which is a VHF set that was used in a number of Allied aircraft during the Second World War. And luckily for me, that radio didn't require a complete nut and bolt restoration. It required some electronics restoration, alignment, some mechanical work, cosmetic surgery. In other cases, I've had early radios out of Lancasters which have rubber-coated wire that's all frayed and perished and disintegrated, and in those cases, you basically need to strip the radio down to its bare bones, replace all the wire, There is reproduction cloth wire available for those to make it look like the original wire, but it's actually got modern plastic-covered wire underneath the cloth. And, depending on the state of the radio, we'll make an assessment and restore it accordingly.
And now this message from MyCom America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. I just looked at the amateur radio contest schedule through the end of the year. It appears that you could be busy just about every day, including the CQ Worldwide and other contests coming up. Prepare yourself for the contest season by upgrading your ham station with the latest rigs from ICOM America. According to Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL, my guest in episode 208, the IC7851 is the best HF transceiver on the market today. It has the competitive edge that you've been looking for. Raise the bar and hear what others cannot with this flagship HF and 50 MHz transceiver. This is due to ICOM engineers focusing on a new local oscillator design that drastically reduces phase noise. This noise reduction and purity of LO results in an RMDR of 110 dB, allowing you to hear the extremely weak signals, making the IC7851 the perfect rig for making contacts at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. In addition, this fine rig has crystal clear LO design, spectrum scope, dual receivers, and a digital voice recorder. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Additional features include RF direct sampling system, 110 RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way that an entry-level HF transceiver is designed and has set a new standard. This rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. It includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD memory card slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose for this contest season, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com, and when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, do you go as far as to put new electrolytic capacitors in old electrolytic cases in order to make it look like it's a vintage radio inside?
It really depends on the set that I'm restoring. So if I'm looking at something like a Collins R390 where it has plug-in capacitors, I'll generally remove the guts out of the old plug-in capacitor and put new electrolytics inside that shield so that the radio looks original. You haven't compromised its structure and you don't have unnecessary wiring tacked on everywhere. Other radios, I'll basically put modern capacitors in place of the old capacitors. I'll try and use the same axial capacitors and route the electronics in exactly the same position it was originally, because interestingly enough, it's quite critical in some receivers that the components are placed in certain ways and oriented in certain directions, because you get coupling effects and all sorts of things. So, and if it's something that's very old and very historically important, I may even drill holes through the original wax capacitors and stuff new capacitors into them. But generally I will replace the components with modern capacitors, but use axial caps that can align in the same way as the originals and replace wiring where necessary. And I will do the safety stuff. So if it's a mains operated set, I'll make sure I'll put a component there which will allow the set to start up slowly, and I'll make sure it's fused appropriately and that all the cords and everything are tagged and tested and replaced so that there's no safety issues.
Now you've got digital cameras and smartphone cameras and things like that. So you take a lot of pictures beforehand before you even start the work, just to make sure that you've got references in order to put it back the way it was supposed to be?
I do. It's a handy thing to do, to take photos of everything before you start pulling them apart. Also the process that you use to dismantle them. So laying out your workbench and having boxes so that you can put all the screws in the right places, and when you're reassembling the radio, it goes back together the way you pull it apart. it becomes specifically critical when you're dealing with something that's very complex. Things like the Collins ART13, which has basically a 10-channel pre-select with multi-turn clutches for all of its dials. So you basically tune the receiver up, lock all the dials, and then when you switch the channel selector back to that position, it will magically turn all the dials back to that preset station. Well, all of the mechanicals around that are immensely complex. And so laying out your boxes and making sure all the little tiny clutch plates go back in the right orders and everything's been assembled correctly is key. And so that's the process I use. I basically I take a very practical approach to removing all the parts, dismantling them, putting them in little boxes and plastic containers, labelling them, and then so when I reassemble it, I've got photos, I know where the parts are, and it goes back together the right way.
What you're talking about kind of implies that there's some kind of mindset, like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance. Do you have to actually be in a specific frame of mind to be able to start a project like this? And how do you pace the project in order to be able to meet the deadline that you set with the club?
So, look, sometimes things don't go according to plan, obviously. You have to be in a frame of mind where this is something that you're doing for enjoyment as a hobby, and it's something that you want to go and work on. When it gets to the point where you put too much stress on yourself from the perspective of a hard timeline to complete a project, then it becomes somewhat of a chore. You may rush things, which inevitably leads to disaster and costs you more time. So my general approach is I decide that there's something I want to work on, and I know I've got possibly 8, 9, 10 months to actually get a piece of work out of the quality that I want. And then I will basically set aside some time, through the week and the evenings to work on that. And if I get to the point where I believe that that work is not something that I'm enjoying doing on the evening, I can always walk away and come back another time. So it's something that I learned from my technicianing days, where if you're going down the path of getting stuck or getting stressed about anything in particular, it's always a good idea to walk away, have a think about it, even if it's overnight, sleep on it, as they say, and you'll be surprised how many times where you're going away and you're having a cup of tea and maybe watching a little bit of TV and the solution to a particular problem will pop into your mind. So it is a bit of a Zen type approach. You can't push yourself into, aimlessly working on it night after night, because then it doesn't become an enjoyable exercise and you don't enjoy the fruits of your labour.
What's the most challenging radio that you've restored from the beginning to end?
Probably the most challenging receiver that I've restored to date will be the E52 German receiver that was manufactured by Telefunken during the Second World War. Now, the Telefunken Coin E52 is a rare receiver to start with, so finding candidates that are restoration worthy is a challenge in itself. I was lucky enough to find a couple of candidates, one of them in Germany and one of them in Russia. The one in Germany was always intended to be a part set, although it arrived first, and I basically did an assessment on that and thought I'd wait for the second receiver to turn up. The second receiver, unfortunately, through shipping and going through customs in Russia, was disassembled by Russian customs because they didn't actually know what it was, and then very, very heavily damaged. So they basically cut coil wires, broke the band switches, damaged parts of the chassis, and it's a cast magnesium chassis. And then the radio turned up over the period of 8 months in various pieces in different boxes until I eventually got all of the components back together. Now, that particular receiver is complex in its design, and it was basically the predecessor that subsequent Collins radios were designed from in the Cold War, and that particular design was also used by the Russians all the way up until the 80s. It has a glass ground ceramic shaft that goes through a series of capacitors, tuning capacitors, and then it goes into basically a differential arrangement which has 3 gears which turn the base of the PTO, the aerial tuning capacitor, and a series of filters. So it's quite a complex receiver in itself. From its mechanical standpoint, it's beautifully made. All of the gears are split gears with springs to take any backlash out of them. The ceramic shafts are all ground to very, very close tolerances. And the radio itself has 2 dials for displaying the frequency. One is a rough mechanical dial, which just has a needle indicator, which indicates the frequency you're on. And the other is a glass disc inside the radio, which has microfiche on it, which then projects the kilohertz for the particular band you're on onto a ground glass dial in the very same way that you would project microfiche onto a microfiche reader and display that onto the reader display. Each class microfiche disc was coded or encoded to its various receivers, so they basically built the receiver and all its modules and then impregnated the glass disc, and it was basically aligned to that particular set of modules that were in that receiver. So if you had a broken glass disc, you were in a lot of trouble, and hence they kept a second disc at the telefunken factory. The other part that was interesting on that receiver was the power supply. So that receiver would operate from any voltage, AC or DC. And all of the components throughout the receiver are modular. So they were all plug-in modules, and you can basically remove the front cover, remove the power supply module out, and then remove all the individual modules and work on them independently. The valves for the receiver, the tubes, are all, with the exception of the power supply, all plug in from the front of the receiver. So you open the 2 covers, and all the valves can be plugged into that receiver. And all the valves from the telefunken factory left with identical capacitance. So with most valve tube receivers, when you change a valve or a tube, you have to realign the receiver. The Veremark, in their specification for this receiver, stipulated that all the valves would be tested and specified that will all have exactly the same capacitance, so they could hot swap valves in the field without having to retune or play with the receiver in any way, shape or form. So all in all, in essence, it was a challenge from the start. When I started the restoration of the Russian receiver that had been damaged, I had to remanufacture the band switch cams. I had to remanufacture all of the separators that separate little fingers from the contacts. And the way that I approached that was I glued all the pieces together that I had in the boxes, made molds, and then cast them in resin, and then machined them down to the tolerances I needed for all of the switch assemblies. I then had to make replacements for all the ceramic shafts that had been damaged, and that took some time. Repair some of the chassis, and then attack all of the tuned coil assemblies that had been deliberately cut, in other words, rewiring all the coils. And I was quite successful in getting everything going, with the exception of one band that proved elusive. I'd measured the remnants of the wire for the coil. I'd used exactly the same type of wire, or I thought I'd used the same type of wire, and the oscillator wouldn't function on the top band. And after about a week and a half of testing every single component and all the temperature compensating capacitors, I decided to take that coil apart again and try a different type of wire on that coil. And lo and behold, just using a different type of wire resolved the problem. So that was probably the most one of the most challenging repair jobs, because it had been deliberately damaged. It was an extremely complex receiver from a mechanical and electrical perspective. And, you know, it threw in the little challenges at the end there to keep me going. But it was quite a wonderful evening when I heard WWV on 10 megs for the first time on that receiver, after it had been laying dormant underneath a Russian farmhouse for some 70 years since the Second World War.
It's not the first time I've heard a story like this, but I'm astounded. Do you have an apprentice?
Do I have an apprentice? Well, I am trying to teach my youngest daughter about electronics. There's a lot of colleagues that are interested in military radio that come over and I share my expertise with. and I try and share as much as I can, not only through my website, but also through the Tube Radio Australia Facebook page, where we have videos of various radios that we've got going and a few of the restoration bits and pieces, so that people can see what's being done. But it's interesting these days, I don't see the keen interest in electronics that I did probably in my youth. But as I travel around the world, and I did go to a Hamvention in Friedrichshafen in Germany, I was very pleased to see a lot of young children all sitting on the workbenches, playing with kits and electronics, and being directed by their fathers and people in the radio clubs, basically developing the next generation of electronics and ham radio enthusiasts.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking about is all of the skill sets that you deployed to repair this radio, including making casts of the parts that were damaged and then filing them down or machining them down to the tolerances that you needed in order to make the thing work. I guess I'm wondering whether or not these skill sets are either taught or they're acquired. It sounds to me like they're acquired, maybe through doing the work. But whether these skill sets are needed in the future. What do you think on that? Do you think that the skill sets that you're deploying to repair these radios are skill sets that we as human beings need in the future?
Look, I think there's always going to be a need to have those skills, but the technology that we can now deploy for those skills is changing. And I'll give you a very good example. I'm working on a project at the moment where I had to make a particular metal component. It's a plate. It has a lot of holes and strategic locations. It has to be very accurate. And if I was to approach that with the skill set that I was taught when I was in school and through technical education, I'd map that out on a piece of steel. I'd mark it out. I'd drill the holes. I'd cut the holes. I'd machine the holes. I'd use a mill to do that. So having to do this and wanting to be able to replicate this multiple times becomes a problem. It's great if you want to restore something, but if you want to remanufacture that component, I basically took that piece of metal and drew that in CAD, and then was able to send that CAD file to an organisation that would laser cut that piece out for me to a high degree of accuracy. So the skills to do the drawing are still a fundamental requirement, and I think that's something that we still need today. We need to be teaching our children how to do these things from an engineering perspective, all of the principles that are involved. The technology that they use now to take it from an idea or a drawing and deploy that to something in the real world has changed. There are obviously things like 3D printing that's available for rapid prototyping. In the old days, we would basically take a piece of timber or a piece of wax and machine that down to the shape we want so that we could design the sand molds for casting. Now we can design that on a computer, 3D printed, and then send it to the casting foundry to have that component manufactured. And then when it comes back, it goes to a machine shop to finish it. So I think the skills are still required. Do I think those skills are being taught in the schools and universities today? I would have to say that probably not the same level of skills that we had where we had to practically know how to do those things with our own hands. But I do see that in the universities that they are teaching them how to develop things using computer-aided graphics design and more modern technologies.
What CAD software do you use then to make a design, mechanical design?
I basically use a freeware CAD program that I downloaded, and it's open source.
Do you have a 3D printer?
I do have a 3D printer, and
It's my understanding that 3D printers are evolving at an exponential rate. Where are you at in 3D printing in terms of you have a 3D printer? What kind do you have, and does it solve all the needs that you have at the moment?
It doesn't solve all the needs that I have. It does assist me in building little tiny components that would be very difficult to manipulate on some of the machinery that I have in my workshop. I'll give you an example, building little insulators for tiny switches in band switching and things like that. I basically have a very low-cost Chinese 3D printer. At the moment, I'm only using it to print plastic substrates. There are other printers available that will print metal substrates, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So, and that's something I probably would look at in the future for just doing prototyping work, to just basically test out your design, whether it be a switch or a component that you're making. The other interesting thing about 3D printing is when you're looking at printing very thin layers of metal, the opportunity to be able to print a flexible circuit board onto a plastic substrate becomes an interesting prospect, because you can make some very small hybrid electronic components to prototype something. And so from that perspective, the 3D printer is handy for me.
Are you doing any work with surface mount?
No, I don't have the equipment at home to play with surface mount technology. I generally farm that out to other colleagues that I have that have laboratories that do advanced surface mount repair work.
And now this message from QRP Labs. After watching a video interview with Hans Summers, G0UPL, owner and chief designer of QRP Labs and its fine array of kit products for ham radio, at the 2018 YOTA Summer event in South Africa, I am convinced that QRP Labs will be one of the most exciting ham radio electronic kit destinations this year. In the video, Hans describes his approach to transceiver design, starting with his original Ultimate 3S and the yet unnamed single-band, single-sideband transceiver that will sell for under $100 US. For everyone out there that believes that you have to spend the big bucks to get into amateur radio, you should know that you can build a high-performance rig today with a kit from QRP Labs. What I have learned from doing over 200 QSO Today interviews is that the novice experience where you built your own rig and operated it to make contacts is the most satisfying first ham radio experience. Hans' kits are extremely well documented and supported by Hans and his community on the QRP Labs website. It just takes a soldering iron, some basic electronic tools, and some time to build the QCX transceiver kit for under $50 to get on the air. This full-featured kit has its own test equipment built in to allow you to align and set up this rig. All of the QRP Lab products can be enhanced with additional boards and accessories to allow you to build more rig as you gain experience. If you are a new ham, or an old ham that wants a new amateur radio experience, or even want to repeat your novice experience with the latest technology, then click on the link in this week's show notes page and give QRP Labs a visit. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. And now back to my QSO Today. What's the most important piece of test gear on your test bench?
Ooh, the most important piece of test gear.
Your wife comes to you, she says, okay, most of this gear has to go. You can keep 3 pieces of test gear. Which 3 pieces would you keep?
Because it would be a signal generator. I've got a very nice HP signal generator, early one. It would be my HP spectrum analyzer, because that's extraordinarily handy. And it'll be my sweep generator. That'd probably be the 3 top ones that I use quite a lot in a lot of the receiver repair work that I do and alignment work that I do.
Ray, you say in your biography, my other hobbies are vintage cars, motorbikes, trail bike riding, camping, 4-wheel driving, engineering, scuba diving, and anything technical.
Yep.
It seems to me we should spend the rest of our time on this interview in this QSO that we're having talking about time management. How do you make time for all of these activities?
Well, look, the interesting thing is that with all my hobbies, I'm a member of a number of clubs, and we have certain times of the year that we'll go and do different things. So obviously in the winter time, you're not going to be going and jumping in the water anywhere or doing anything like that, and you don't really want to be on a motorcycle. But in the summertime, you definitely do. So, from a time management perspective, look, I've got a family. I've got an elder daughter and a younger daughter. I basically play with my electronics in the evenings when everyone's asleep. And from a hobby perspective, doing the things that I love, I include the family, and so it doesn't become too much of a challenge to plan and book when you're going to go and do certain activities through the year. And that way, it makes life a little interesting.
Now, do you find that on a project, on these restoration projects or working on electronics in the evening when the family's asleep, do you find that the sustained constant effort, the daily effort perhaps, or scheduled effort is what makes you successful in finishing these projects?
You need to try and plan out when you're going to do it and what you're going to do and how long you're going to dedicate to it. As I said, you've also got to be in the right mindset at that particular time to actually want to go and do that sort of stuff. So I generally won't start a project until I'm ready to. And sometimes I come across projects where I'll get to a certain point and then I realise that I have to go away and do a lot more research or go and talk to some people. And so that project may sit on the side of the bench, for a few months until I've got all the right information and I'm then in the right mindset to reattack it. So it really is a matter of deciding what you want to achieve. And for everything that I've built over the last 35 years, in my collection, whether it be vehicles, whether it be radio equipment, it's really a matter of deciding this is something that you want, you're willing to put the effort in to getting it and fixing it and getting it to the level that you want it to be at. And in a lot of cases, I do all the work myself. I don't tend to farm anything out. I basically get in there and even with vehicle restorations, I can basically attack every single component of a vehicle, from the wiring, the mechanical, the paintwork, all the engineering, the repairing, the welding, anything I need to do, I can do, because I've learned those skills over a number of years through different bits and pieces of work that I've done.
Now, out in Graceland, do you have a big warehouse where you do all of this work, or do you have your projects spread around town?
So in Greystanes, where I live, I have a very nice large garage area and a sub-basement where I basically tinker with my electronic stuff. I have a colleague of mine who has a factory unit that he's kind enough to share with me, and some of the pending projects are living there. And another colleague up in the bush that has a big mechanical workshop where we tend to put some of the bigger military projects that we've got underway because we need access to his gantry crane to get bits and pieces off them.
Off the floor, perhaps. Yeah, that's amazing.
Off the vehicles.
Oh, off the vehicles. We're not talking portable equipment necessarily.
Well, no. Look, I'll give you an example. There was an estate locally that notified me that they had some military equipment that was going to be sent to scrap, and we went out there and assessed it. And there's a beautiful 30-band, 44-kilowatt sideband transmitter that was basically going to go to the scrap metal merchants. So we recovered that transmitter, and it's basically two massive rack mount chassis, which each weigh about 700 kilos, and a three-phase transformer that weighs 900 kilos, plus the dummy loads and everything that came with it, the oil-filled dummy loads and all the other bits and pieces. So the logistics of recovering that and then getting it to somewhere where we could move it around was interesting, but we were able to save that piece of equipment, and at a point in time it will be restored and cleaned up and could potentially end up in one of the museums or in our private museum.
Now, a 44 kW sideband transmitter was what, used for a HF broadcaster or something like that?
No, it was used for military comms. So basically, they were doing international military communications, probably RTTY comms, and it was basically continuous. So it was probably rated at that, but I don't know if they would have driven it as hard as that.
Do you have a favorite man-pack military transceiver that you like to take to the field?
I do. My favourite, probably my PRC 77 is my favourite man pack, because we tend to use the 6 metre frequency quite often, especially at the field days and areas that we go to. It's probably one of my favourites because of the way it's constructed internally. It was well ahead of its time. It's definitely not light, but from a 6 metre perspective, it's the magic band, and we like to get out on 6 metres and use that frequency.
Do you have the TaddyRAN version of the PRC-77?
No, I don't.
The PRC-77, I think, has come up in a number of QSO Today episodes. The most recent was with Dr. Ulrich Rohde, who was sorry that he didn't design it.
Yes, probably the other man pack that I enjoy, if you're looking at the HF bands, is a man pack called, it's an AWA set called an A510. And it was manufactured around the time of the conflict, Malaysian conflict, mid-50s. And it's a shortwave transceiver, and the transmitter and receiver are in two separate pouches. It uses 1-volt miniature tubes. The receiver is extraordinarily sensitive. It uses a long whip antenna that goes into a little antenna tuner. and it's very effective. It's almost like the pre-selector on the Yaesu FT101ZD from the sensitivity perspective. So, that's another favourite pack that I like to use, and I actually took that man pack over to Dayton one year, and we did one of the nets there, the 80-metre net with that set.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
It's probably had a fairly positive impact. I mean, obviously, you make a lot of friends and colleagues all over the world when it comes to amateur radio. If you're sensible about, when you're going to go and play with the radios and what you're going to do and what times, and basically make sure you've got the right balance between family and your hobby, I think that's a very important thing. And generally, when the wife says it's time to come out of the Radio Shack and join the family, you have to listen. But it's had a very positive impact on my family life, probably on my working life as well. It's given me the ability to talk to people in a way that it makes it fairly easy to break the ice and make good contacts all around the world.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Look, I think probably the quantum leap that's happening now with a lot of the DSP radio stuff that's happening, where software-driven radio technology is starting to come to the forefront. It opens new opportunities for people and young people that aren't necessarily an electronics guru, but have the capability to sit there and do software programming to get into the hobby as well. So I think that's very interesting. I think that there's still some challenges ahead of us. I mean, there's obviously a lot of contentious issues with the noise that is being generated by a lot of modern electrical appliances. But I think from my perspective, just some of the advanced technologies that are coming up in the software, radio-defined software space are very exciting, and I think that's going to open the hobby up to a lot of new potential amateurs.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Look, I think the advice I'd give to them would be try and think very carefully about what you want to get out of the hobby, limit your expenditure, and just basically start off gradually, select the components that you want to build your station and really enjoy the thrill of doing that. I think the big thrill for me all the way through my amateur radio career was always being, building my aerials or, assembling my station and getting them up and running and making those contacts and understanding all of the aspects that are involved, whether it be the electronics aspects or the atmospheric aspects and the commercial aspects. So obviously you have to decide what it is you want to do and what you can afford to do and basically go down that path.
Are you planning on going to any of the shows? Are you going to Dayton this year or next year?
Probably next year. I haven't made the decision yet. It'll either be Dayton or Frederikshavn. It really depends on some timing with some other events that are happening. I've got a rally that I'm attending for a charity event for the Cancer Council in Australia. So, and we've got to drive basically across the Australian continent.
Wow!
In a beat-up old car that doesn't cost any more than $1,000. So, and we're raising funds for the Cancer Council research. So that's going to be sort of around about the same time as Dayton. So I just want to see how that timing works for me.
How long does that race take to cross the continent?
It's really an endurance event, but it's about 10 days to drive across Australia, and we're not using the sealed roads.
Are you driving?
Yes, we've got two drivers in our vehicle, so you basically switch drivers, so you don't get tired. I mean, you drive for 8 or 9 hours through the day, and then we stop for the evenings, and it's a planned event, so there's support vehicles and all the rest of it, but it's just a charity event. To make sure that we can all get across as a group. I think there's 200 entrants, and the rally is called, of all things, the Shitbox Rally. It's a bit of an Australian term, so you have to take a shitbox and drive it across Australia.
It sounds very Australian, for one. It's probably one of the reasons I think so highly of Australia. At some point in my life, I'd love to visit Australia, and it sounds to me like the Shitbox Rally might be an interesting way to see Australia. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you definitely see the dead centre of Australia because it does cross through all the deserts, goes up to Uluru, which is there's rock, and then back down through the middle of Australia, across New South Wales. And most of the middle of Australia is red desert. So it's an interesting way to see that part of it. But the coastal areas are where most of the nice places to see in Australia are.
So it seems to me that you have to do the Shitbox Rally and then come back from Perth or wherever it is where you end up, and then take the coastal roads home.
Yep, that'd be the way to go. Or if you go from Perth to Sydney, and then from Sydney head down the coast and go down the coast to Melbourne, across the Great Australian Bight, doing the Ocean Road, the Great Ocean Road, and up to Perth. You'll see a lot of nice areas through Australia there. And then you've got to basically fly from Perth to Brisbane and do up the coast from Brisbane. So that's really more the tropical region, the Gold Coast, the Great Barrier Reef. They're the areas that you would probably want to see.
Is the tropical north of Australia as nice as the south?
It's just different. It's just very different. It's like the difference between the Rocky Mountains and the Californian coast. It's that sort of difference, you know what I mean?
Having lived in both, I can get it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You've talked about some specific radios. Can I take pictures of those radios from your site and put them in the show notes?
You certainly can. You certainly can. And as I said on my Tube Radio webpage, if you look down the right-hand side, you'll see the restoration sections, and there's all the restorations that were done on various radios. They're not all there, but some of them are there. I just sent you a couple of links to some of the more interesting ones. Some of them are old restoration, and I haven't updated the page. But also on my Facebook page, on the Tube Radio Facebook page, there's videos there of radios running that I'd restored, and there's some interesting stuff there that you can... the SCR 522 with the ratchet tuning mechanism actually working up close, stuff like that.
I'll look for it. Thank you so much. And 73.
You're welcome. 73. Cheers, mate.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ray. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VK2GRP in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Beep, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.